the power. I thought it was important, given the power that is associated with Peter and the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And so thought it was important to include two other readings from two different communities who also dealt with the acknowledgement of Jesus's identity, but brought, unfortunately, no reward. So while Peter might seem to be the point man in today's gospel reading from Matthew, he is not the point man in the Gospel of Thomas. In John, it is Martha who names Jesus as the Anointed One. And as we all know, the churchmen regarded her confession as second rate. Paul, who described the events who described the events and people in the early church in real time as it was unfolding, he does not defer to Peter as a leader, does not regard him as being anyone special, and actually calls Peter a hypocrite in his letter to the Galatians, because Peter withdrew from table fellowship with the Gentile Christians, and Paul did not like that. They were clearly not buddies who worked as the dream team, and they did not found the church in Rome. Prisca and Aquila did that. And Paul is not alone in his view of Peter. None of the early documents of the church regard Peter as Pope. Even Augustine in the 5th century does not know about the presumed power of the Bishop of Rome. He did not know about the keys to the kingdom of heaven or the binding and loosing of sins. Instead, it was later believers who canonized the Petrine primacy point of view when they came to appreciate what the bestowing of those heavenly keys could mean to those who wielded power on earth. So point of view, as you know, from back in English classes back in the day, as you know, it is a very important part of life as well as art. We have the glass that is half full or half empty, or the day that is either partly cloudy or partly sunny, depending on your mood that day. And if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, did anybody have a chance to see that? A misinterpretation of what appears to be a chance meeting can lead to hurt feelings and a whole constellation of unfortunate events that are based upon assumption and not fact. So while the point of view expressed in Matthew solidified the constant tradition of the church, of what we become the institutional church, you can see from those two other readings that there were other views that were just as fruitful to the communities that use those gospels. These alternative views were weeded out over the centuries, and they were labeled as heresy, when in fact, all they were was different. Those who believed in these different points of view were forced to bury their holy books in the desert to save them from saints like Athanasius, who, like all autocrats, went on a mission to burn all books that did not agree with his point of view. A millennia and a half later, those scrolls so lovingly buried by believers what were unearthed in Egypt, and they have given us the Gospel of Thomas, which we read today, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which we usually read on the St. Mary Magdalene's feast day, among many other holy books. And many of these books, with their different points of view, debunk the idea of a constant tradition. So, what happens when you are finally able to see things that were once covered up by an institutionally enforced narrative? One of the beauties of modern times is that the discovery of these books, in conjunction with 20th century liberation movements, have helped to remove the institutionally affixed scales from our eyes. And for 2 millennia, we only got part of the picture, the part painted by the churchmen, who were deeply, deeply invested in those keys and who wielded them as a weapon rather than in love. And when people of color, women, LGBTQ plus people were finally able to raise their voices in disagreement, those words that were regarded as being true for all eternity took on a completely different cast. And so we can and we should move beyond the story of Peter and the keys and the binding and the loosing of sins by frail human beings. Because you know what? In the whole scheme of things, it really doesn't matter. God and God alone is the final arbiter of sin. And the divine never did put a lock on the doors to heaven. And it is Jesus who is the rock of ages, and not Peter or any other man. However, so talk about heresy. All right. But there is a very, very important element to this story, one that usually gets lost in the adulation of Peter, the popes, the clergy, and the value of blind obedience. And that question, my brothers and sisters, should make us sit on the edge of our seats. And that question is, who do Christians throughout the ages, who do they regard? Who do they think Jesus is? Who do we think that Jesus is? Because in the scheme of things, as I said, who Peter thought in those guys really doesn't matter. So the answer to that question should reflect the life and mission of Jesus, who came to heal the brokenhearted and free the oppressed. Unfortunately, it doesn't. So when there have been 29,000 deaths during migration journeys to Europe since the year 2014, who do churchgoers in Europe think that Jesus is? When the governor of Texas sends a busload of migrants that includes a 3-week-old baby 1,600 miles to another state that is experiencing a major hurricane, who do the churchgoers in Texas think Jesus is? When Christian American governors and state house members curb the voting rights of people of color and actively persecute LGBTQ people, who do they and their supporters think that Jesus is? When the number one cause of death in children is gun violence, who do gun-toting, church-going Christians acknowledge as their Messiah? When the Christian nations of NATO have enough bombs to blow up the world several times over, who do they say that Jesus is? When the Catholic Church leaders covered up the sexual abuse of children, persecuted LGBTQ people, and banned women from the altar, just who did they think that Jesus is? As I always say at the end of the petitions, we are always bowed by the enormity of the world's pain. And all of us sitting here are just ordinary people living ordinary lives during a time, like most times, that has had its share of very, very serious problems. And not one of us, not one, has any level of power to fix anything on a grand scale. And our importance lies in our value to our families, to our friends, and to the various communities that we belong to. And yet, the good of the world, indeed, the very future of the world, depends upon ordinary folk just like us, as we do our very, very best in our very ordinary way to reject the glamour of evil that is embedded in blind obedience to wealth, to power, and to men who insist that they hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And so there is a Jewish saying that every age has 36 righteous people. And without the presence of even one of these righteous people, the world would come to an end. And you know, as I look around at the people here in this room or the people here on Zoom, I see far more than 36 righteous people. And so together, in our imperfect and most ordinary way, we will help to save the world.